Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about Peterson's chapter 2 on the nature of science and the compatibility or the harmony between scientific explanations, scientific points, conclusions, and theistic or at least Christian, some proudly Christian claims. And there are some Christians that are kind of fundamentally Christians that they read, especially the book of Genesis, in a particular way that denies or attacks or undermines or clashes with some discoveries in cosmology, Big Bang cosmology, for example, or some advancements in evolutionary biology, like um, Darwinism or some version of evolution. So there are some theistic people that say things grounded in the religious views that clash with some scientific observations. Let's not deny the fact. One of the things I really like about this book, however, is that here Peterson does not represent those kinds of people, right? Peterson represents a group of people that take science seriously. And that opens up a very interesting philosophical discussion. Taking science seriously, now we can ask legitimately whether some broad religious claims about theism are compatible with science or not. And Peterson argues persuasively that theism is the worldview home of science. So up until now, in the setting up of the chapter, he's just been kind of laying out the terrain, giving you the terminology, giving you like the basic shape of his arguments, and giving you some fair rules of engagement, but hasn't actually given you any reasons for thinking that his views are correct, and certainly has not given you any reasons for thinking that theism is the home worldview of science. At the end of the chapter, however, he does give you some reasons, and the rest of the book is dedicated to providing some reasons, some justification of those claims, not merely stating the claims, but justifying them. And here are some of those reasons for thinking that theism is in fact the home worldview of science. And here is some general claims, and later on there will be some more specific claims. But here's what Peterson notes. Science, understood in the realism sense, science as the enterprise that tries to describe the way the world is, must make two assumptions. For science to succeed, for the activities of human investigating into reality that are, that is science, for them to succeed in describing the way the world is, two facts must be in place, two assumptions are part of the kind of what gives rise to scientific inquiry in the realist conception. And one is that the physical universe has a coherent or intelligible rational structure. The second one is that human beings have the rational capacity for understanding that physical universe. So there must be a match between the intelligible structure of reality and the capacities that humans have for grasping that intelligible structure of reality. Humans must have the capacity to know that, and there must be something there to know. So reality must be intelligible, and humans must be intelligible with the capacities for knowing the thing which is intelligible, right? Unless you have these two assumptions in place, science cannot get off the ground as a realist understands it. And here's the probability claim that is going to appear many times throughout the book. The probability that science succeeds, that it manages to describe the way the world is, given theism, given that God exists, is higher than the probability that science succeeds given no God. Why? Well, precisely because of these two claims, says Peterson. For science to succeed to describe the way the world is, at least approximate the description of the way the world is, there must be an intelligible structure to reality to be discovered. Reality must be intelligible. And humans must have the rational capacity for understanding that physical universe. And if God exists, it makes sense that it is not surprising, not epistemologically surprising, it is reasonable to think that God would create a world that is rational, intelligible, and create beings capable of knowing, capable of having those rational capacities for understanding reality. So if your worldview includes theism, it is perfectly reasonable that these two assumptions are there, right? It fits well with your worldview. However, if your worldview is naturalism, it's just surprising and it's puzzling that reality has an intelligible structure. And it's also surprising, that is epistemologically surprising, it's puzzling that there are beings that are capable of knowing intelligible structure of the universe. That there are rational beings capable of knowing is puzzling given atheism, and that the world itself is intelligible is puzzling given atheism. You wouldn't expect that to happen if atheism, naturalism were true. Here's what Peterson says. Regarding assumption 1, for a rational, orderly universe to come from a rational creator makes preeminently good sense. It's what you would expect. By contrast, naturalism, metaphysical naturalism, requires the intelligibility we ascribe to nature is something brute and inexplicable. So note here, Rousseau's anti-realism. Rousseau realizes this, and he realizes that both assumptions that Peterson's putting forth are puzzling in the atheist perspective. So Rousseau gives up on science success in the way in which Peterson understands it. For Rousseau, science is just a human construct to try to make sense of our perspective, but it's not an actual adequate description of the way the world is. Regarding assumption 2, theism implies that a rational God might create rational creatures. It makes sense that if there's a rational being that is a creator, it will create things that resemble it in some way, especially if rationality is the ground for morality and morality matters. It's not surprising that that's what God did. Naturalism, however, does not imply, or it's even likely that rational creatures would arise. Consciousness, rationality, mind, those are very puzzling things that come about if deep down there is no intelligible, there is no God that is guiding things. So given those assumptions, they make sense in a theistic worldview. You should expect science to succeed in a theistic worldview. It's not that they're incompatible with atheism. Of course, they're not incompatible. They're compatible with atheism. They're just more puzzling that they're there. They're epistemologically surprising. And because they're epistemologically surprising, they count in favor of, they give us reasons for thinking that theism is the better explanations of the two over naturalism. Peterson continues. Rousseau, on the other hand, embraces epistemological anti-realism. Why? Precisely because he recognizes that those two assumptions I just articulated, Peterson just articulated, do not fit that well with, are surprising given naturalism. The position that knowledge is socially constructed, that's anti-realism. Controlling metaphors for him are essentially human cognitive projections onto our reality that we cannot actually know. There is no guarantee that there is an intelligible reality. I'm sorry, that reality is intelligible. Then the thing that given to us to a sense has a rational structure that is knowable. And there's no guarantee that our capacities match that. And we have no, if we're atheists, we have no way of reasonably believing that. And Rousseau is an atheist, he sees that, so he gives up on the project of describing reality as it is. Reality as it is cannot be known. It's only the social constructs that we project onto reality to try to manipulate it and understand how it works to some sense. Although scientific realism, Peterson's position, is often caricatured as the notion that we have pristine and perfect truth, it is actually the idea that we are gaining increasingly accurate and complete knowledge of reality, refining and improving as we go. So in general, there's this thing that philosophers call the principle of charity. And the principle of charity says that if you're to talk about a position, you know, anti-realism, realism, theism, atheism, and so on, the most charitable way of going about doing that is allowing the proponent of the view to articulate the view as they see fit, right? Let's give the best possible reading of any of the alternatives. It is a caricature. It is a fallacious move to only understand the view of the other through the lens of your own view. If that's the only thing you're doing, you're failing to be charitable towards the interlocutor. So when we try to make sense of the distinction between realism and anti-realism, we can best make of the distinction of the notion of anti-realism by looking at what Rousseau has to say in support of it, because he's an anti-realist. And we can make best sense of realism by looking at what Peterson has to say about it, because he's a proponent of realism, right? So we should not think of, we should think of realism in the way in which Peterson puts it forth, because he is the proponent, right? That's the most charitable way. Let's give both Rousseau and Peterson as much possible room as they can so they can articulate their views in the most reasonable way they can. And then we engage with those most reasonable versions of the views. So realism is not the caricature notion that we have pristine and perfect truth. We just look at the world the way it is, this kind of naive thing. No, it's actually the thought that we can, in principle, know reality, that there is a reality there to be known in the scientific practice, is a way of coming to know it, at least approximate to get closer to it. That's a more nuanced conception of realism, and the one we should adopt because that's Peterson's conception. We're talking about Peterson. Theism makes the existence and nature of science less epistemologically surprising than naturalism does by readily supplying and reinforcing the assumptions which science rests, the two assumptions we just discussed. On the assumption that naturalism is true, the existence of science and the objectivist realism is unlikely. Indeed, it's epistemologically extremely surprising. We are saddled with anti-realism about science if we're atheist, says Peterson. But they're both not very satisfying accounts of the nature of reality. They're not the best explanations. The best explanation for science is that it is subjective, that it's realist, and the best way of making sense of that conception of science is if there's a God that created reality in that way that is intelligible and minds human beings in a way that they can grasp and comprehend the intelligible reality. And that just is the worldview of theism. So theism is the worldview home of science. Objectivist realist science, claims Peterson. Okay, let's end here. I'll see you next time.